this part of resistance is not value neutral. This is something that affects the left more than it affects resistance and opposition on the right. Opposition and resistance on the right tends to reach for violence as a tool because of the function of violence, how it works against people as a chilling effect, how fear works, and how the expression of violence and violence as a symbol works for the right to reinforce their authority. The left doesn't work that way.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other.
Hi, I'm Ben Price, CELDF's Director of Education and Coordinator for CELDF's America 250, a Revolutionary Perspective project. Welcome to our podcast, This Revolutionary Moment, in conversation with Tad Stoermer. With me is my friend and colleague, Tish Odell. Tish is CELDF's Director of Consultation and our first line of contact with communities and resistors looking for guidance and strategies. It's our pleasure to join Tad Stoermer in a conversation about what resistance is and needs to be in this revolutionary moment. For folks who are intrigued by CELDF's America 250 series, Tad Stoermer is the public historian for you. Tad is the author of A Resistance History of the United States, just released on June 2nd. And A Public History of the American Revolution, scheduled for publication in 2027. Tad is one of the most widely followed public historians in the world, reaching millions each month with his YouTube resistance history updates, morning reports, constitutional myths, public history practice, America 250, and resistance history playlists, to name a few. Tad's particularly known for his analysis of the American Revolution and the mythology that continues to shape how Americans misunderstand themselves. He grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, served as a reconnaissance scout in the U.S. Army, and spent a decade in Democratic politics before turning to American history. An alumnus of Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the University of Virginia, where he earned his PhD in history, Tad began his public history career at Colonial Williamsburg. He was a Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Fellow at Harvard and has held major fellowships at Brown, Yale, and Monticello. Tad currently teaches public history as a lecturer at Johns Hopkins, is a visiting scholar at the University of Southern Denmark, and is the film and digital media editor of the Public Historian Journal. Tad, a warm welcome. Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just I just want to say, give you a little of my background. I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio, and Ben was actually my mentor. I didn't like history very much when I got into this work trying to stop a project in my community. Fracking was coming, and that's how I ran into CELDF. And it's interesting because I took my first democracy school back in 2012. And the reason I'm telling this is because I think maybe a lot of our listeners might be in the same position. And I know when they taught the part about the revolution, and Ben talked about the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and and he tells the story about the closed doors, right, and the blackened windows and all, and not at all what I'd learned in school. I mean, I went, oh my God, we had a coup and we didn't know it. And we weren't taught that. So this idea, I think, of unlearning before we can actually learn new ways and new ways of thinking is really something that I got out of it, and we talk about the idea that the system isn't broken, it's fixed to work exactly as it was set up to work, and that we're actually the ones that need to break it and create something different and better.
Well, I don't need to be here. I mean, you just nailed it right there in 30 words. Quite nice. I can leave.
Well, thanks to Ben and that, I now like history better, so I really like enjoy your book, right? Which I might not have back in 2012, but no, I think I would have.
Well,
But
and
anyway,
I
I
come to
just
this
like
actually from an environmental background too. I used to be the national communications director for the League of Conservation Voters.
Oh, wow.
And that's one of the things
Okay.
I in fact did when I was in politics, working with local, with the state LCVs and local LCVs in order to be able to work within grassroots organizing to engage in the democratic process. So I've got an idea what's wrestling behind the curtain here.
Well, yeah, it's like when you butt up against that idea that, oh, well, harm's coming, we can stop it, and then you realize the system doesn't let you stop
Yep.
it. So,
And you
however we
wonder,
all do this.
and you wonder why you have to continue to fight the fight. Why
Mhm.
the same enemies continue to confront you, and why you're not having the kind of success that you deserve, even if you've checked all the boxes and you've crossed all the T's. And it's because of the structural issues that you just pointed out.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's
over the years, when we first started in 1995, we were very traditional kind of environmental organization. We'd assist communities to go into the hearings and to protest the permit being issued and point out the reasons why it shouldn't be and so forth. But by around 2001 or two, or actually 2000, we began to say, this is a waste of our time. We can even stop the permit temporarily, but there'll be a new application filed. Whatever the deficiencies of the application that we pointed out to stop it will have been plugged. The right forms and the traffic studies or whatever it was that needed to be accompanying their application that wasn't will have been settled, and they get their permit. I mean, the office was invited down to the White House. Al Gore was vice president at the time, and he was going to give us a little plaque for being just, great at, like over 80% wins on the permit blocking and all of that. And it was just embarrassing because we had to say, yeah, but all 80% of them were then approved afterwards. And so it's a systemic corruption. It's not a corruption of persons. It's the law.
But Ben, what you just pointed out is how American political culture functions. We are taught to go ahead and accept that award, reinforcing our role in our democracy and doing what it is that we need to do in order to push back abusive authority like that. We are told that fighting the good fight in that way, when we're just putting temporary roadblocks in front of the things, that's the happy warrior. That's what we need to be doing. And even though things continue to roll along as they have always rolled along, you're just expected to go ahead and get up there and file the next block. And then when that gets knocked down, file the next one. You are fighting the good fight then. Our culture rewards that kind of ongoing surrender to the broader system, because it makes you feel like you've participated in the democratic process. You've been heard, but the system worked on.
right.
Ongoing surrender. That's almost the language that we've used. I've called when they get a small concession, we're going to put in the data center, but we're going to give you a setback. Instead of 100 feet, it'll be 200 feet from the
You're supposed to
stream.
celebrate that. You're supposed to be happy with that.
And they're going to shut down operations on Christmas Day. And that it was not only supposed to, but traditional environmental groups do celebrate that. And when I say, so you've agreed to terms of surrender, I see some of them get angry. Some of them say, so what else can we do?
Yeah.
There you go.
That's the ones we want to talk with.
Right.
It's interesting because that whole idea of like language is so important too, and what they like teach us, and what is resistance. And so I know your followers, Tad, have heard you say many times one way that resistance doesn't equal protest, and that real resistance has to go further than expressing discontent or outrage, and a lot of us have lived that if we've gone further than just going to the hearing. But we often phrase it as the difference between a moment and a movement. And so I wanted to ask you this question, like, how do you actually define resistance? And to be clear, what is being resisted? And also, has your definition or beliefs evolved over the years? Because I also find with organizing that people have such a difficult time admitting that they may have changed or evolved in their way of thinking on topics. They get stuck. So open it up.
Yeah, let's let's deal with that bundle. Like the first one in terms of what is resistance? Well, it's both. It's an act, it's a process, and it's a subject. And obviously the act is in the moment of doing what you need to do to push back abusive authority. That's kind of the most capacious sort of understanding of the verb. And we think about it in the context of, here in the 250th, the Declaration of Independence. It is probably the least talked about right that's contained in the Declaration of Independence. The right of the people to alter or abolish a government that has become destructive of its ends. And that has been in the past, because of the way American political culture works, that has been conflated into the right of revolution, the right of rebellion, the right of overturning everything, rather than understanding what it means to, in fact, actively, through direct action, compel a government to change its ways, to change its relationship before you get to the point of abolition, to completely alter those relationships. And that is sort of historically and sort of, in terms of the right of resistance, that's what that resistance means. But to me, in looking at American history the way that I have, it's identifying it as a process. That how do you evolve from the point of identifying and articulating a grievance, operating through protest, through organizing to make sure that grievance is heard, and that it is, and we'll get to your other point, Tish, that you referred to before as well, in terms of, well, what work does a protest do? From there to organized opposition, and then from organized opposition, when that proves to be insufficient to affect the change that you want to see, to direct action, and direct action in the most kind of extreme forms of resistance, to in fact put direct pressure on and to coerce change. And so that in American history, it is a stage-based process. I don't want to rip out all the heart from it, because people have to do this, of course. But in understanding the function of protest and organizing opposition, moving up to direct action against resistance, and what each of those has to do historically, and then the other part of that is, and what keeps that from happening, right? What keeps an opposition, it keeps a protest from organizing into an opposition. What are the countervailing forces against it? They're cultural, they're legal, they're constitutional. And to understand that, as to understanding why protest and opposition has not succeeded in the way that it should, or the way it deserves to, as we talked about before in American history. And there are explanations to that. And then the other part is as a subject, right? Sort of understanding what people are doing, not just in the United States, but everywhere, in order to work within their contexts to affect change at scale, structural change, rather than just, as Ben, as you pointed out with your process, rather than temporary reform, rather than holding patterns, right? Rather than rearguard actions. No, actually forcing structural reform when operating through the system has proved to be insufficient. And so to your question, Tish, about has it changed over time? Hell yeah, Tish, it's changed over time.
Good. I was hoping you'd say that.
I mean, I used to think, when I was working in environmental politics, 30 years ago, understanding the importance of door to door of all of that kind of grassroots activity, to see that it is insufficient, to be clear-eyed enough about the kind of change you want to achieve, and more to the point, to be clear-eyed enough about the hurdles that are standing in your way of achieving that change, and being involved in a culture, and this isn't just to the environmental community, but to a culture that agrees to not go as far as they need to. Ben, you pointed out, is that when the reaction is, well, what else are you going to do? It's an answer to that. There's an answer to what else you're going to do. Well, you know what? We're going to go a little bit further. We're going to, in fact, push on this, because we need to go ahead and organize in these ways and not take the stasis as the permanent status quo. And so it's understanding, particularly when it comes to organizing, when it comes particularly the function of protest, that the idea, I think that when I was younger, in thinking that the clear articulation of the grievance was sufficient, that that other people will hear us, and they will be so impressed by the moral weight of our arguments, that of course they will change. And if they don't change, we just need to be louder. We need to be more persuasive. We need to reach them in better ways, rather than understanding that they don't care because of the kind of structural things that you've been talking about through this whole process. That structurally they don't have any reason to be responsive to hear you, but who can hear you are the other people around you, in order to identify your allies, identify the people with whom you can work in order to leverage resources and operate at scale, to bring pressure to bear where it needs to, and to be clear-eyed enough about that, rather than just kind of, so it's really two ways. Is that I used to think that you could, in fact, just fight the good fight. That, and I believed that the system was fundamentally sound, and that it, in fact, could be navigated in order to affect meaningful change against corporations, against the structural impediments. And then you recognize that pattern is a pattern. It's a set pattern. It's not simply bad actors, or it's not simply the system that has been twisted or distorted from its noble path. It's, in fact, as you said, this is functioning as it was designed to.
Yeah, well, and to that point that Tish made, about the change of mind that happens. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I was just steeped in Philadelphia, the birthplace of American democracy. And
I knew where the accent.
Probably. Well, it's a bit mixed. I haven't been back living in the Philly area for a lot of years, but but I mean, where the Liberty Bell is, where, all of the monuments, where Constitution Hall is, and there's some sense of belonging and pride about that. Yeah, I'm from the birthplace of American democracy. But clearly, when I got involved in community organizing and kept running up against the legal system that I had faith in too, but it was clearly stories that I believed in that were holding me back from understanding how it actually works. And we have to look at that when we go into a community and start talking with them about, we're going to have to do something different from what you've been doing. You're comfortable doing it, but we can't keep that up because you're going to lose. And and we always say right up front, you're going to lose if you do it the traditional way. You're probably going to do it. You're going to lose if you do it our way too, just to be clear. But at least, you're actually going after the crux of the problem instead of, the symptoms, go for the cause. So I guess what I wanted to do is, so here we are in 2026, and it's being marketed across the country as the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. I know that's the signing of the Declaration, but the implication and the conflation is that they're one and the same. We had a revolution, they say, and that led to the founding of the U.S. So the premise is for nationalistic celebration, and it turns out that much of the associated hype and pride it's based on stories that we've been told about the nation's founding that just aren't true. Beginning with the claim that the intent of the men and women who fought the war, I mean, all of them that fought the war for secession from the British Empire, was from the beginning to establish the nation that we think of as the United States of America. So a significant number of your videos and presentations and dialogues with followers and articles, that you work to set the record straight by challenging and debunking what are frankly historical lies perpetuated in our schools, our national iconography, and on every national holiday. So why do you think it's important to correct and neutralize? This may sound like a silly question to ask at this point, but why is it important to correct and neutralize those feel-good myths? Do they really do any harm? What is the reason to worry about it?
Well, some national myths are okay. They can inform a kind of harmless identity, but the way that they operate in American political culture isn't in a harmless way. That we have a nationalist political culture that is informed by a nationalist history and historiography. And so that history is an explanation of the way power works and the way those power channels are supposed to work. It is a reinforcement of a particular institutional structure, and that reinforcement is operating so powerfully as to lead people to not question it. And when I talk about that, the nationalist history, essentially it exists to legitimize and reinforce the version of the United States government that was established in the Constitution of 1787. And even to diminish the structural changes that were made as a result of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but to celebrate that one as the through line in American history, and with such reverence that questioning it is considered to be not just absurd, but it's anti-American. It's unpatriotic. You're a traitor if you really talk about ripping apart the Constitution. And that is the way, that most of our mythology, in fact, works. Folks on the right and the left are all originalists now. Everybody refers to what Thomas Jefferson thought, or James Madison thought, or Alexander Hamilton thought, or what John Adams might have said, and refer to that as somehow being controlling on the way we interpret things in 2026. It's a strikingly conservative way to look at the world. And without understanding that what America has become in terms of the expansion of rights has been the product of people excluded who have pushed and fought to change those definitions and expand those definitions. That history is diminished in favor of the history of the great founding. And we kind of get to that point, which is with what you just pointed out, that the founding of America and what matters, this conflation with the American Revolution, it starts in 1776. We think of the war as the revolution. We think of George Washington as being a center point of the revolution, and the war as carrying that through, when the war doesn't have anything to do with it. I mean, it's related, but that's not the American Revolution. I mean, the American Revolution started as a result of the 7 Years' War and the dispute between the colonies and Britain, and the concept of rights and responsibilities and consent, and the whole idea of government that is renegotiated as a result of the Proclamation of 1763 and the Stamp Act, and then the consequent disputes over the imperial relationship. That is what led, like what John Adams points out. I'd sit there and say, don't pay attention to John Adams, but now I'm paying attention to John Adams, is that when he looked back on, in the 18 teens, when he looked back on he looked at what people were saying when it was approaching the 50th anniversary of the revolution, he was already upset that they were getting it wrong, that they were conflating the revolution with the war, with the Constitution, all as one moment. One inevitably led to the other, which inevitably led to the other. So it was intended for independence from the beginning. That independence was declared. The war just supported what was already going on. And then the Constitution was the ultimate expression of that. As historians, we know that that's ridiculous. But Adams, having lived through it all and played a part in most of it, pointed out that even by the 50th anniversary, people were misunderstanding what that had been. And he pointed out why that was a problem. And his point bears repeating and bears understanding, that when you focus on Washington and the war, you can stop thinking about the rights and the responsibilities. Because the war, as Adam said, the wars do what wars do. That the wars aren't about ideas. War is about who has more guns than the other guy went on the right day. That's a whole different matter. Even the diplomatic efforts of the war, that's a whole different matter. When you're talking about, for Adams, the changes in the hearts and minds of Americans, that's the revolution, particularly in the relationship with Great Britain. And he said, to understand that, you're going to have to understand what went on in each of the colonies, what went on, and what went on in that long period. He says the revolution was over before shots were ever fired at Lexington and Concord. We don't need to be that we don't need to be as narrow as atoms. I mean, we can sort of see the way that those ideas were working, not just in privileged white people. We can see how they're working sort of across the scale in the colonial world, and how that conversation doesn't stop at when people start shooting. That conversation goes on, and doesn't necessarily end when the shooting stops at Yorktown. And so, but when you focus on the war, you don't have to talk about any of the ideas. You don't have to talk about any of the messy stuff. You don't have to talk about any of the resistance. You don't have to talk about any of the internal conflicts. You can just accept that the point was independence from the beginning, rather than just being something that came exceptionally late. And so therefore the creation of the American nation state was always something they had in mind, rather than a contingent outcome. And then, more to the point, that the creation of that version of the United States in the Constitution was the necessary outcome of that process. When you put all that together, you don't have to talk about ideas. You can focus on armed conflict as being the nature of the American Revolution, where it's just an armed rebellion to throw off a tyrant. That doesn't have anything to do with ideas. That is somebody who you think is acting tyrannically. People can understand that kind of opposition. And then that immediately goes into this strong national government in order to protect that. So when you connect all of that into the bundle of the American founding and the American Revolution, and you assign that these values about nobility and about genius and about wisdom, almost existential and wisdom, that then you get into real trouble. And then all of our stories about the founding and the founders, I mean, even the terminology we use is put into that bundle. And so we get to the point where when these stories are told, again, on the right and on the left, that it just reinforces this idea that moment is controlling. That moment determines the American identity. And you hear it in the language all the time. We must return to the promise of the founding. We must return to the better angels of our nature. We must get back there. We've somehow diverted from the path, which was noble at first, and somehow got hijacked by reactionary enslavers in the 1840s, and then Abraham Lincoln needed to descend from heaven to bring it back. Or today, if you listen to Clarence Thomas, it's the progressive left. But either way, it is understanding that founding is, we can't treat it as it was, and in not treating it as it was, we can't get at the ideas. And in not getting at the ideas, we can't get at, in fact, the nature of the rights and responsibilities that we should be thinking our government should be serving, and that isn't. No, we can't really question that. We have assumed that they made all of the right decisions then, and we need to go ahead and accept the decisions they made as both the floor and the ceiling of all acceptable change. And that's why you get to the fact that only reform is allowable. Only temporary reform within the system is permitted, and right, rather than anything that involves structural change.
Yeah.
So that's right. Why it's harmful.
So just spinning off of that a little bit, there's a short window of history that doesn't come with the rest of the story, with the founding fathers and that kind of language. And when I think about, so the Articles of Confederation, not the greatest piece of democratic literature I've ever read, but it's certainly better than anything that came before. But then, I mean, in terms of where these people have lived and what kind of rules they've had, but then they also...
They did what they were designed to do.
I'm sorry?
They did what they were designed to do.
Right. But I think that what we get is the language of the Declaration, and people say, there's some inspiring language in there, some phrases that sound really great. But there's never really, or there's seldom any indication of how that might have been played out in real, the empirical world. And yet we have something like the Pennsylvania 1776 Constitution that did not have a governor that could veto the legislature, the representatives of the people. It was a committee of 10 people from the different counties of the state. They didn't have a Supreme Court. They had a council of censors, citizens elected from their local areas that would come together. Okay, it was only every 7 years, but it was like, well, we're going to judge whether or not the legislature and the executive committee has been doing what the Constitution told them to do. And if not, we're going to tell them, sorry, that's no good, that law's no good, and we need to have a constitutional amendment to fix stuff. I mean, those kinds of things were there, and they, of course, they're damned by history. They didn't work. They were just way too democratic. They were, it was mob rule, all of that stuff. I mean, that's the language you get.
Yeah, that's the language of the nationalists who want to shut it all down. It's the same thing that they hurl at the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, like I said, they were doing what they were designed to do. It was a limited tool. It wasn't that the Articles of Confederation failed. It's that they weren't doing what the nationalists wanted to do. They weren't doing what Alexander Hamilton and his focus on money wanted to do. And so,
right.
And with the meaning the locus of power in the states. And within that, because they hadn't yet gotten around to deciding that they were going to ban debtor relief and ban the issuance of paper money, that the locus of power in the states, and then even within the states, locally within those states, that kind of small d democratic presence was real. It wasn't perfect, but they were still working it out. I mean, they had only been independent states since 1776. And while there were certainly problems, they just weren't doing what the nationalists, what the corporatists wanted it to do. There was no groundswell of support for a constitution, for a federal government. That's why the Annapolis Convention failed miserably. They didn't put any kind of impetus to putting together a national government until Daniel Shays and a democratic power scared them. And to understand the way that when we talk about the Articles, which is exactly the way that they talk about the Pennsylvania Constitution, your new video on that's fantastic. I just finished watching it. That is the language of the Federalists, of the Nationalists, for why it needed to be shut down in favor of the more robust robust in a sense of exercising that kind of centralized, consolidated power. That's not the only way to look at it. And it wasn't the only way to look at it at the time. Right. It was looking at things through the lens of the Declaration of Independence. People didn't look at it through that lens at the time. And they didn't look at the Articles through that lens at the time. They didn't look at the Pennsylvania Constitution through that lens at the time. They had this moment. I'm not going to say it's rosy because it was problematic in different states, but where there are these experiments with what they're doing with each of the state constitutions. Somewhat more interesting and more democratic in the North, much more exclusionary and much more reflective of the structure of government they just left in the South. But you see in those constitutions a much more interesting discussion about the relationship of government to governed that is a result of independence and kind of these little, I don't want to be too grand and call them these little, laboratories of liberty. That's overstating it. But it is interesting that they are thinking in different ways about how that power should be organized. And I think probably the best example is the one that you cite is in Pennsylvania.
Which some other states copied,
like. How does that be consolidated into a story that suppresses those discussions?
Right, yeah. Right. So does it make sense to bring those stories back up to make them live again? Yeah.
Yeah, I always tell people in the communities we're organizing with, that it's like the system doesn't want you to do. They want you to go to them, right? The higher ups, right? With the authority and the power. And they don't want you talking to your neighbors in your community and sharing that's scarier to them.
Yep, absolutely. It's Daniel Shays all over again, right? The ghost of Daniel Shays is alive and well. The last thing they want is for committed people to talk to one another because they might get ideas.
Exactly. That's what I always tell them. So when you go around to petitioning, it's not that they're going to maybe put your your proposed law on the ballot, or they're going to like put it on the ballot for you. But every petition signature you get, you're sharing that idea with that person. I want to get back to the, because we're talking a lot of our listeners know some of, have bumped up against that wall we talked about. And so they're very interested. A lot of them now is like, well, how do we resist? Right. And I know in your book, you talked about that campaigns are typically interrupted. And I think, we've seen some of that there's several places where that happens. And I know when I was reading it, it made me think of, the people I know, we do a lot of environmental. So they'll go to the EPA, right? They go to the environmental institutions. And even though they know they have all this data and facts backing up that it's not protecting the air, water, and soil, and that it's actually harming them, like poisoning them and all that, but they still protect it, the mythology of this. So I guess, I'm just kind of curious, like what your thoughts are. If you could explain to our listeners what these interruptions are in your mind, and how do we get them past some of those, maybe?
Well, I mean, they're kind of choke points for opposition and resistance. That they're the reason why these things don't really get going. And so when we think about them, the first one is really how our culture operates to channel all legitimate opposition. There are only a couple of ways you can protest. There are only a couple of ways in which you can effectively act. And you have your permitted channels through which you need to work in order to affect any change, whether it's lobbying, it could be legislation, it could be the electoral process, it could be the regulatory process, right? That there are these channels that are set up to funnel your opposition through them and cool it down. That's how they function. But that might be okay if our culture didn't tell you to think it was entirely sufficient. That if you are told, if it doesn't work, then you're just told to try again, because it's all fundamentally good. It's fundamentally fair. It's fundamentally just because of the stories that we tell each other. And so one of the first choke points is a cultural one that tells us, well, what else are you going to do? Well, nothing. This is our system. It's a great system. We just need to try again, because the permitted channels are the most legitimate and valuable ones. And certainly compared to an unthinkable, any set of alternatives, rather than, in fact, engaging in more. If you want to stop a plant, start chaining yourself to a tree, right? To a fence. That, while it might be acceptable in some circles, it is for most people, that's going a little too far. But that is because of our cultural norms. That's got nothing to do with whether or not it's the right thing to do or whether it's effective. You need to go ahead and go through the permitted channels, and because our permitted channels are so sanctified, that's where the first round of effective opposition kind of goes to die. And so when we think about the way that resistance can escalate into organized opposition, and you start leveraging your resources to try to operate at scale, then there are legal choke points, but there are constitutional choke points. But then you've got sort of those. You get up to essentially the point at which you need to break the law. If you want to do the right thing, if you want to engage in direct action, and that law can be, that can be private, that can be trespassing law, right? That the way that our law is constructed, and our cultural reverence for that law means that interrupts most people who in fact want to engage in organized opposition. If you want to go ahead and put yourself, and we've seen this language and heard this language so much over the last year, you have to respect law and order. You have to respect the security forces. You have to respect the police. You have to respect ICE. You have to respect them. Why do you have to respect them? If they are engaged in immoral activities that run against our concept of justice, you are expected to privilege their abuse of authority, their abuse of their authority, rather than our principles of justice. Why? Because because the law privileges that idea, and because our culture reinforces the privilege. And so you are seen as not just being a criminal. You're seen as being an extremist. You're seen as being a radical,
a terrorist.
A terrorist. The language follows very, very quickly. And it's the kind of discussion that I have all the time, where people ask if whether or not I'm advocating for violence, right? There's a
Oh, we
and
get that too. Yeah.
that's well, exactly, and that's the next choke point. So the first one, that second one's a legal choke point. But if the abuse of authority continues, then you've got to take the hit and decide you're going to go beyond that. So that's what that's what collective resources are, right? Is that making sure that people have bail money, making sure that people have lawyers, making sure that you've got that sort of community support in order to navigate that part of the system, because you know that it needs to happen. And that's something that happened. It's fantastic in looking at it. It happened at scale in the 1840s and 1850s with vigilance committees and others. They weren't just moving enslaved people from working with the Underground Railroad to move enslaved people from slavery to freedom. They were raising money to go into courts, to get people out, to represent them in front of the courts. They were engaged in all of this stuff to throw wrenches into that enforcement mechanism of unjust.
Mm-hmm. I love the part you talk about John Brown. I know I read that, and it's totally related to today for me. Like, so the people question condemning John Brown for the violence that he committed, but they never questioned the violence that was happening to the slaves and the slave patrols. And we have people that come to here with data, stacks of data, knowing they're being poisoned, their kids are being poisoned, and yet they're like, well, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, and that's it. So when you look at, and that's the discussion of violence, right? So, and that's the last choke point, right? Is that because it's not about violence, it's about direct action, whatever it takes. And that was the toughest chapter to write, in trying to come to terms with that in a way that made sense based upon the experience of these people, rather than just talking about it in an academic philosophical sense. I really wanted to see how that was operating in the minds of the people who chose to enable John Brown, understanding what the consequences were probably going to be, and how they understood that dynamic and what they based their decisions on, and recognizing that because all of these choke points, they developed and operated in American culture and American law in the First Republic, which is why I centered the story there. The book was, the original book until the middle of last summer was 20 pages going through Stonewall and Act Up and Standing Rock. It was 20 chapters. And then when I thought more hard about it in terms of the function of American resistance, the nature and scope of it, what are its components? What are all the parts of the dynamic? It all emerges in that first 80 years. So we can see the way all opposition and resistance operates after that within the context that established. And so when you look at the decision to support John Brown to take that ultimate step, and we can talk about how the language operates against this today because cultural and to a certain extent moral objections, is that the idea was that slavery needed to be ended by whatever means, and more to the point, that people needed to start stepping in the way of other people who were trying to enforce and expand slavery. The goal wasn't necessarily, we can talk about what John Brown was thinking at a given time, but as far as the people who chose to enable John Brown, the six that I focus on in New England, that they had to come to grips with the idea that action was absolutely necessary, that in fact disruption was necessary, that interruption was necessary. That is not choosing violence as a goal. None of them chose violence and destruction as a goal. What they accepted was that as a possible, even probable consequence. But what they had to do is understand the range of consequences of their direct action. And it's a lesson that is very interesting because it operates, this part of resistance is not value neutral. This is something that affects the left more than it affects resistance and opposition on the right. In that opposition and resistance on the right tends to reach for violence as a tool because of the function of violence, how it works against people as a chilling effect, how fear works, and how the expression of violence and violence as a symbol works for the right to reinforce their authority. The left doesn't work that way, because because the left understands. I know I'm treating this as a broad brush, but this is the way it tends. Understands that it's a losing proposition on the left, because the right normally holds the tools of abuse and authority, that it can do more harm than good, and there's plenty of evidence that that's the case. When the kind of goals that I find it, I don't want to assign left or progressive to John Brown and what's going on in the 1840s and 50s. Even though we are talking about the expansion of rights, we're talking about things in a broadly conceived liberal context. But this idea that it is a waste of time and energy and money to go ahead and focus on violence as a goal, if your goal is substantive. If your goal is about actually achieving an expansion of rights, is about stopping abuse of authority, violence doesn't achieve that in and of itself. What you have to do is be tactical about your deployment of direct action, even if you can understand that violence is going to be a likely outcome. It can never be the goal because it's counterproductive. It's dumb resistance. It doesn't achieve your goals. Because as they understood that if you just went ahead and went in the direction of Nat Turner, what happened to you is what happened to Nat Turner. And that's kind of the tactical choices that John Brown made. John Brown didn't go to Harper's Ferry because he was intent on killing as many people as possible. That's the outcome. But the goal is to be disruptive enough that you're able to go ahead and identify where the weak points are in the system and exploit it in order to disrupt it. That is the goal of most of that kind of resistance. But what happens is that because of our cultural choke points, the right and to a large extent the comfortable middle will immediately see that and reduce that to violence. And there is a major chilling effect that all you want is fear. It happened in the 1850s to what the Sikhs were doing. Every time that they bought guns to send to Kansas, there's already violence. There's violence in the enslaver state. There's violence in the enslaver's abuse, and there is violence going on. Outbreak of war in Kansas in order to go ahead and expand the enslaver's influence. That's already there. But yet the hurdle that the Sikhs were running into are people in Massachusetts telling them that they won't support that effort because that's supporting violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's absurd. And that's kind of what they understood, is they were able to see through the deployment of that language that operates intentionally as a chilling effect on opposition because it raises the specter of fear, and there is no more powerful effort in that than making people afraid, and that's the most powerful tool that abusive authorities have, is the ability to instill fear, and that's kind of what happened in the 1850s. But you can see the people who recognized that rhetorically what was going on, who recognized it, Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Henry David Thoreau, who recognized that was a smokescreen, a bait that they couldn't take, that they had to continue to focus on the fact that you have to first take your heel off of the throat of the oppressed and your role in that. That's Thoreau's language. And understand what in fact is functionally going on that is keeping that oppressive authority in place, and the tools that other people are doing to insulate that. And that language, which it runs through not just our political culture, but runs into kind of an American moral culture, is there. And sort of it is this idea that this particular violence that runs counter to my conscience is somehow of greater moral authority than the actual violence, the actual harm that pesticides are doing in your water, the actual people that are dying right now, the lives that are being spent right now, with all of that abuse of authority. That no, your moral conscience is somehow of a greater value, and we should culturally, we privilege that decision. We don't question the fact that people were deciding not to support efforts to end slavery. And we don't assign a kind of moral responsibility there for then allowing slavery to last another day, get worse another day, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people abused, exploited, brutalized every day because of the inactivity, because of the refusal of people in the middle to in fact act. And that's a major structural problem. So that's a long-winded answer. I probably should get better at doing short answers of these. But that's a long answer to how these choke points work, that they're legal, they're cultural, but the most powerful ones are cultural.
Yeah.
Because it's not just that there are laws, it's the weight that we assign to those laws. It's not just the Constitution, it's the weight we assign to the Constitution. It's not just a kind of moral framework, but it's the weight we assign to those moral values. Those are all cultural. And that culture is reinforced by the stories we tell about ourselves and our identity as Americans and what we privilege, when even that is based upon a distorted understanding of where that past came from.
Yeah.
Tad, we have and maybe a strange way of looking at the way change happens, but it seems like in our experience, it's when things get bad, when authoritarianism rises, and this is prior to Trump. It's not just all about the Trump regime and so forth, but when the system itself crushes people's rights in their communities. And obviously, we've been talking about local communities because that's where we cut our teeth and it's where we work. We drafted local laws that started with the presumption that people have a right to make decisions for themselves, to say, you cannot trespass on our bodies with your poisons, things like that. That the ecosystem has rights, that we were pioneers in rights of nature, which is now a global movement that is also being corrupted in many ways by the system that exists. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I didn't study history all my life, but when it became important to me to understand why we were running up against roadblocks all the time in the communities, trying to use a system we thought was supposed to serve our interests, that it never would. Matter of fact, just the opposite. It became clear that something big had to change. And, testing that system with local laws that directly challenged Supreme Court decisions, that corporations are legal persons with Bill of Rights protections and so forth. We did those things. And we knew that it wasn't the time, it wasn't the moment when any of that was going to stick. They were going to get overturned. And we told the communities, likely this is either going to get ignored or overturned. But now we seem to be in a little different situation where we've been saying feels like a revolutionary moment. 2026 and 1776 rhyme in some ways, not because of the fake history, but because of the circumstances in the country. And tyranny and the way that there is no or little regard for human beings who don't have the clout financially to do something about their situation. One of the things that comes to me, and it's just an impression, but when there is a revolution of sorts, well, the revolution in the mind is one thing, but when there is actual action towards establishing those rights, towards protecting those basic premises of a functioning culture, we don't have many opportunities to make the big changes to go in that direction. And maybe we're in one just because things have gotten so bad. And again, that's our observation is it's only when people get hammered over the head with their lack of rights that they start demanding rights. We don't need to write laws that protect rights if those rights are just part of the culture and everybody assumes, well, you'd never violate that. We only need the rights in the laws when they're likely to not be upheld. My question, I guess, really is, in a revolutionary, how can we plan ahead? We got the three Civil War amendments after the war. And they should have revolutionized the Constitution. And in 1883 and in 1886 and all of the Supreme Court decisions that wiped it out and said, no, these rights in the Bill of Rights are only as against the federal government. Oh, yeah, then the 14th Amendment changed it to state governments too, all of those things. But you still got a corporation is a private actor, even though it's chartered by the state, even though it's licensed by the state, even though it's permitted to do the things that it wants to do by the state that harm people in their communities. It's a private actor and therefore cannot, according to the court, in the civil rights cases of 1883, they cannot violate your rights. It's impossible. It's not what rights are all about. What can anyone trying to make these revolutionary changes do to prepare to teach the next because we're not going to live forever, and the next generation's not going to remember the things we went through or the things we learned. How can we preserve for them the notion that they're going to take it away from you as soon as we're gone? If we can get to that point.
Yeah. I mean, you got to clearly identify the structural issue that's going on. People don't see it. And then you refer to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's a great example to look at. The idea that you could enact legal change, you could enact judicial change. They restructured the federal judiciary. You could enact fundamental, transformative constitutional change. There are other structures that are still at work, still in place, that you can't get to, that are still operating. That are social, that are cultural, that are corporate. To people to understand, in fact, how their society is in fact working around them, and not in a conspiratorial way. This is in fact how it is working, and when you see it, you can identify it. When you can identify it, you can do something about it. But I think that to prepare for that is to make sure that people, in fact, have a clear understanding, a clear resource for understanding how those structures are working in their lives. And they're not. But what I want to be very clear about. I mean, I fail, but I try to be as clear as possible about this in the book, is that structures don't do anything on their own. That people make up these corporations, people make up these structures, people are making these decisions to understand exactly why those people are working with. Obviously, those systems, those structures enable those people to make the decisions they're making. But we have to understand that we have to focus on those people who are doing it too. And so, because I think that we can get a bit caught up in these abstractions and instruments and mechanisms. I know I do all the time. But to back off of that and say, well, hold on, they don't in fact move on their own. You got to have people who are moving them. And we need to understand that dynamic. And to continue to point to the people who are doing this, the people who are acting in this way, and what are their motivations. Because it's so much more effective to be able to point to person A, B, and C and talk about their position, talk about their motivation, talk about how they got to where they were and why they're doing what they're doing, to understand that as being a focus of change, why they got there, because that speaks to structures too. What enables them, what supports them, what provides their kind of mindset. Rather than and making sure you're combining that with an idea about how these structures operate within one another. And that's the frustration of the radical Republicans, is that they couldn't abolish the enslaver mindset. They couldn't abolish the enslaver mindset. They could end slavery. They don't end enslavers. They don't end the enslaver mindset in financial networks in the South. They don't end the enslaver mindset in the legal networks in the South. They don't end the enslaver mindset. You can't abolish the enslaver. You can only abolish slavery. Even though they tried to. They had plans about how you were going to reorganize socioeconomically the broader South and empower freed Black people. But they couldn't get to that point. It's a wonderful way to understand, and Charles Sumner was able to lay this out in a number of ways. It was a very sophisticated understanding of the socioeconomic dynamics of the South and what fundamental transformation of that towards a democratic end would require beyond the constitutional change and the judicial change and the legal change. Because without that fundamental root and branch approach to changing financial economic conditions, which led to changing social conditions, you are not going to be able to change mindsets. And so I think I think by understanding how that works, we can sort of see how people are acting within these systems today. And you can prepare other people for action and other people for what's coming by helping them identify, in fact, where the problems are, rather than the smokescreen that establishment folks continue to throw at you, that continue to go ahead and misdirect to say, okay, well, it's really just about the next election. We have a couple of bad actors in office. If we just get rid of them and you get us, the morally valuable people, if you get us in charge, everything will be better. It will go back to normal. It will go back to the same kind of process that you've been fighting. These are structural problems that we have, and then we're going to require structural changes. But structural changes require the people to actually make it happen and move forward with it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love hearing you talk about it that way because it aligns perfectly with something we've been working on for the last 3 years. I've been working really hard on it. And it's this model of a truth reckoning and right relationship with communities, because it was an artist who saw our work, Rights of Nature work, and decided, that she wanted to do an exhibit. And I was like, at first, what does an artist have to do with our legal work? On policy, but she taught me a valuable lesson, and it's the cultural shifting part, right? And so that idea, does law change culture or does culture change the law? And we had been working obviously in the legal world, and so we just assumed as more people passed these laws or attempted, it would shift the culture, but it didn't happen that way. And so, I think that idea of starting with the truth, because we start from the wrong place so many times, like regulating the harm instead of prohibiting the harm.
Right. Yeah, well, exactly. Right. Yeah, justice happens after the fact. Justice is
right. And you can't reckon with it unless you tell the truth. But what we also know is it takes courage to tell the real truth, right? And I wanted to ask you, I guess this is my last question for you since we're running out of time, but if you're willing to share some of your personal experiences and pushback you've gotten from actually writing this truthful historical perspective.
The biggest pushback that I get, well, obviously there's the obvious pushback you get from the right. The biggest pushback that I get is from the establishment middle. They don't like me very much. This idea that it's in order to maintain the establishment, these people are awfully thin-skinned about their place and their hold on power. And they tend to call you names, but I don't necessarily care. People can call me whatever they want. But what is very interesting is to see how folks in the establishment and their allies, they bundled together fairly quickly, in order to try to derail you. But the thing is that part of what I see, and it's a difficult question to answer, is that when we're looking at the tools that the establishment use, and I kind of think about it. I think about everything in terms of power dynamics, and in fact, who has the interest to maintain the status quo because of their share of power and authority, and so that becomes less of a partisan issue. You're able to sort of step outside of that. But the minute that you step outside of that structure, again, our cultural presumptions about how politics should work, the only legitimacy is within that structure. The minute you critique the structure, the minute that you point to that and say, well, that's actually not serving the goals that you say you want to achieve. You could be a patriotic American. You could talk about the kind of things that you want for your country in terms of justice and equity and equality. But if you're not doing it within that structure, and using that language and supporting and reinforcing their rules, then you are an extremist, you're a radical, you're anti-American on the outside. And the fact that they carry a lot of weight with the media and they carry a lot of weight with other kinds of gatekeepers, that's the kind of thing I run into all the time. But we can't let that stop us, because one of the things that I get all the time on the good side is the support from people who have, they've read the book, they listen to me, we have conversations. And the bigger point that I'm not asking anybody to take my word for it. Here it is. Here's our history. Here are the records. Here are the receipts. Go look at it yourself. The fact that people say to me, I have not heard that before. How come I haven't heard that before? It isn't because it didn't happen. It isn't because it's not there. It's a part of this structure operating and thinking about who is in fact operating the levers of that structure and why. And the more that I hear things like that this is emboldening, because it gives me my own set of knowledge to act that I can be grounded in and find out on my own, rather than I'm just going to go ahead and reach for somebody's book and sort of read these principles. So the pushback's pervasive.
Yeah.
But we got work to do.
Yeah.
For sure.
We're trying to build confidence and courage in people, because that's it. It is risk. It's risk taking to.
Well, and that's the starting point of all resistance. You got to be willing to lose something.
Yeah. Ted, if you have another minute or so, I got one more question for you. Tish was okay. Just to say,
that was a crap answer to your question, Tish. I'm sorry.
No, I think
it was good. It was good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and we've had our versions of pushback too, from industries, from the courts. We've been sanctioned. Our lawyers have been sanctioned for bringing up the same argument over and over again. That people have a right where they live, in places that they live, to protect themselves, their rights, and their land base. And the courts just don't want to hear that baloney.
Nope,
we have Dillon's rule, and we have preemption, and let's just stick with that. But so one of the things that we've talked a good bit about with some of the interviews we've done with Native people, Native Hawaiian and Native American, North American, and so forth, is, what does this all mean for them? What does it mean for descendants of enslaved people? So what about everybody who wasn't included in the all men are created equal, that hot air balloon at the beginning of the Declaration? And aren't they the same people who gained no additional constitutional rights when the Bill of Rights were amended to the U.S. Constitution, in 1791? I guess what I'm getting to is, what exactly did Americans gain by waging a war against British oppression? And was it really a revolution? What did they gain? Anything?
No. This is that's an easy one, Ben.
That was a short answer. No.
No, that's fine. I thought maybe you might say that.
Listen, it's a fairly easy math problem. Is that who was more free at the end of the war than they were at the beginning of the war? Nobody, except for a war for independence that were based upon this language. It's a quick calculus. Who is more free at the end of the war than after Yorktown, or even after they signed the Treaty of Paris? Who is more free than they were before? There's no fundamental change in that. The same people the same people who were in charge, roughly speaking, in 1774 are the same people who are in charge in 1784. The same people are enslaved. The same people are excluded. Just because more people in clean shirts are able to have some access to the political process doesn't mean anything. And when we're talking about basic concepts of freedom and liberty, what could be revolutionary, what could be transformative, rather than just a shift in government, and that's what Jefferson said it was. He said it was just changing government. That's okay, and I think that we can learn a lot more about the valences of the American Revolution by seeing who was more free at the end. Where were they? What were the products of that? And why? And that's why taking what essentially is a non-national approach to our history and seeing how the products of that revolution, and looking at, in terms of nation states or state actors, at how people are free as a result of it. We can look at the Black loyalists who went to the British. They are more free at the end. Why are they more free? They are more free because they allied with the British. And we can that requires us to take a look at what the motivations really were, what those ideas of freedom and liberty really were, and where they were situated. So when we think about the three countries that emerged from the American Revolution, not from the war, but from the American Revolution, that's Canada, the United States, and the Bahamas. Their modern state, the the direct consequence of what happened in the revolution and then the broader war. If you want to take a look at how revolutionary the American Revolution was, compare the development in terms of liberty and freedom and rights. Compare the development of the United States to Canada. Because the idea is that America, the United States nobody in the United States is more free at the end than they were at the beginning. There are some governmental structural change, but nothing transformative. They can change the language all they want. People can make a big deal. Okay, well, they call themselves subjects versus they can call themselves citizens versus a subject, but that's an abstraction. There's still the disembodied monarch, the king, versus the disembodied people who is sovereign. But that doesn't actually mean a whole lot functionally. But when you look at the way Canada evolves after along the same track, they banned slavery earlier. Canada banned slavery in 1793. And then the way that it develops as a locus for enslaved people to go to, because those rights are protected, they can legally be free. That's what enables the Underground Railroad to start to operate at scale, because Canada has a legal structure that in fact recognizes those rights and protects them. And then you see the countries that in fact, in terms of property protection and women's rights, it's not necessarily better, but it doesn't happen later than what happens in the United States. And so if your discussion is about the expansion of rights and responsibilities, especially of freedom and liberty, in a liberal framework, the United States fails on every single one of those measures, when compared to the broader Atlantic world. And so that's when you talk about, well, how revolutionary was it? Well, if not very. Again, the same people are in charge at the end and were at the beginning. And that's why when at the very beginning I talked about taking a look at the state constitutions, the first state constitutions, as being a very interesting window into how revolutionary they thought it was. What, in fact, is changing. And the only thing that's really changing in terms of the state structures, the only thing that's really changing is the deck chairs that are getting shifted by the white guys at the top. Right. Well, maybe they can go ahead and elect their own government out of them. So they will elect a council of 10 guys who will then choose one of their own as a governor. That doesn't change fundamentally what's going on in any of these places. Right. You can see where it does depart, and that's why Pennsylvania is important. You can see what the alternatives are. You can see what the other ideas are, until the point that I make in the book, that the empire always strikes back. There will always be, because the establishment has an interest in it, there will always be the reaction to what people see are radical aims. But those radical aims are always in the name of the people.
That's right.
So that's why I think that if you want to look at something that is, you have to ask, if you're asking, well, what is revolutionary about it? What changes? What turns upside down? What goes around? And when you're looking at it functionally, not much.
I mean, do you think it can be, I think it can be revolutionary to just turn your back on the system and just start creating your own system. And because we give it credibility and authority when we turn to it all the time and ask it for permission, right? But if I tell these communities, well, create your own food system, create your own government system, create your own healthcare system locally. Like, why do you need, you make them irrelevant?
That's, Tish, I've been saying that for more than a year now, right? That they will have as much authority as you give them. And this is, and we can talk about the consent of the government. We can talk about the kind of consent we give to each stage of our political and legal system, that people can take them back and localize that again and build parallel institutions. There was a discussion that I was a part of when Trump and the regime first removed funding from libraries. Well, make it not matter. Make it not matter. Make it irrelevant, whatever the hell he wants to do to your local museums, to your local libraries. This is something that can be solved as a community and build, as every single effective resistance operation in the world has done, build parallel institutions. When the institutions that are established to serve you aren't serving you, they're serving other ends, or at least not serving your own, you need to go ahead and form those that will. You can withdraw the consent from one and you can apply it to the other, make them irrelevant, make them immaterial. They can pass whatever laws that they want. They can go ahead and pass whatever regulations they want. They can sign whatever executive orders that they want. If you are operating effectively at the community level, it doesn't impact you because you're able to develop these parallel institutions that, as Edmund Burke pointed out, that when people have a weird idea of deciding what the law is. And they will decide that based upon what in fact is serving their ends. Not whether or not there is an institution that is set up that other people say is inherently legitimate. It's only legitimate to the point where it's effective for the people. And if it's no longer effective for the people, then you have the right, you have the obligation to set up your own parallel institution to serve those goals.
Yeah. I've worked with so many communities, and so has Ben, to put laws on the ballots. We have that right in Ohio in our Constitution, and they keep it off the ballot, the Board of Elections or whatever. And I can't find a community yet to do it, but I'm like, do your own election, create your own ballot system.
It's what the Patriot Resistance did in the 1760s and 1770s. It's essentially what Black communities did in the South when they were shut out of educational institutions, established their own. That's why we have historically Black colleges and universities. Establish your own systems. Why the vigilance committees worked in the 1840s and 1850s, because all that kind of resistance begins when people take back their consent and they withdraw that participation and they put that into institutions that will in fact achieve their ends. And that can only though happen effectively locally until you get to the point where you can scale up. But you've got to do it locally and stay in a place that works.
Yeah, we've got to break these myths too.
Yeah, exactly. And again, returning power locally, returning power to communities, returning power to the person, which I think is the best expression of democracy.
Yep. Right. Well, this has been really fun. I don't know we're at like 127 already, but I don't know if you have any closing thoughts that we didn't bring up or things you want to mention that we didn't bring up. So,
well, I think that the only thing that I would want to bring up, there are two things. The first one is to take the opportunity of the 250th to go ahead and push people who are making the celebratory pitch, to push them in fact, what it is they mean by celebrating the Declaration, by celebrating the war. Basically ask, so what? People are assuming that the Declaration, by their definition, is valid and they get to interpret it. Push them. Make them tell you why. Make them tell you that when they assert that the Declaration unlocked all of the liberty and freedom that they claim, make them show you their work. When they tell you that it unlocked America as the greatest country and the greatest force for liberty that the world has ever seen, make them show you their work. Particularly when we're talking about the math of the oppression, the exploitation, the cost that union, the people who had to pay the cost for that union. That's not being a radical. That is about historical math. Make them justify it. And this is the only time we're going to have a chance to, in terms of this commemoration, because people are going to be yapping about it every single day for the next couple of weeks. Yep. I encourage people to make people show their work. And the other thing, though, is that I think the most important of the resistance principles in the book right now, which is force the fight. Don't take anybody's no for an answer. Not when they are engaged in abuse of authority. Abuse of authority has to be shown that it has to make a calculation whether to continue. Make them slow down. Make them pay attention. Make them stop. Make them reconsider. Make them wait another day. Make them wait another week. Make them find another road. Make them call up 10, 15, 20 more guys out of their bed. Make them, slow them. Don't force the fight wherever you go. Don't think that because you can't accomplish something huge, then you can't do anything at all. Every little bit helps when we're talking about an authority that is this abusive at this kind of scale. Every time you slow them, every time you make them expend resources, they have to recalculate whether it's worth it. And if more people do that, then that recalculation starts spinning and they start slowing down. It's what Thoreau called the friction in the machine. You start to be that friction. The more friction there is, that machine might stop and break. And that's what I think people need to keep in mind today, because I think that it seems sometimes that it's such a big problem that it might be too much to deal with. Not when you break it down. Not when you break it down to what you can do locally.
No, I appreciate that. That's perfect. And just so you know, we've used the Declaration of Independence in a lot of our court cases that we've had in our briefs and bring it up. And it's really interesting because the judges either ignore it completely. The right to local self-government is usually
there you go, right?
And they either ignore it or they'll say things in their decisions like, well, the Declaration isn't really actual law.
Well, there you go, right?
Yeah. So it's like, and yet we're celebrating it this year. Like, I would love to get that out to people.
It's controlling. So I don't know what you mean by the law. Not codified. That's it. It's got to be codified. Well, thank you.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway,
it still governs, and that's different.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
No. Well, thank you. We really appreciate this, and
thank you,
Ben. And we're going to put the link. I don't know if there's any other links you want us to share at the bottom of, when we post it on YouTube and Substack, our Truth and Reckoning podcast and all that. Is besides the book, is there anything else you want us to share?
There are my socials, but whatever.
Okay.
It's been really a treat to talk with you, Tad. Thanks a lot.
You're very kind, Ben. I went on a little bit longer in some of these in some of these answers than I should have, but it's late here. So thank you for your patience.
Tish would tell you that I could probably take you in a longevity.
We'll have to try again.
I was already thinking of that. Like, let's have a contest and see if we can go longer with the question. No, I'm kidding.
We'll start earlier. We can keep going.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.